Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 3 of the Clutchdown Podcast. You're back with, actually just Reese today. Gavin's off cavorting on one of his work adventures, and I wanted to get an episode out this week. We couldn't make it work, so today you're just going to get one of those super intense, analytical versions of an episode from me. I thought that since we've spoken a lot about last season, towards the end of the series last year, and we've spoken about some of the draft picks, I thought we after speaking about London, we could now speak about the actual start of next season. It's less than 100 days away now. We got that notification the other day. And I want to look at the best matchups of week one. First of all, starting this week, I want to look at what I think is potentially the top matchup of week one. Before I do that, just wanted to say thank you for everyone for listening and watching last week on Spotify and YouTube. It was actually our best week ever in terms of listens. So the effort I'm putting into cutting all of these little reels out and putting them on Instagram is obviously working, which, is great. Join the discussions, follow us on Instagram, and we'll have more of that. But yeah, let's dive into week one. For me, the most exciting matchup of week one, and it's always a very, very good matchup, is the AFC Championship rematch. Ravens versus Chiefs at Arrowhead, hostile territory for the Ravens. But we've seen that even when they have the games at home, they can't necessarily do it, which was the story of that 17-10 loss at the Ravens Stadium during the last set of playoffs, which obviously then that win for the Chiefs sent them to the Super Bowl. I wanted to kind of dive into that game and the rest of the games in the history of the Mahomes versus Lamar Jackson matchup, and the story of those games, and why in those games the Chiefs have generally had the better of the Ravens. And is anything going to be different this time around in week one, or is it going to be the same story? So I thought I'd look at this. Basically, so far, Jackson versus Mahomes, there has been 5 matchups in their career. The Chiefs have won those 4-1. So Mahomes, 4-1. We know what Mahomes can do to win. We've seen it in these games. It's the Ravens that seem to be coming up short every time. So that's what I want to focus. I want to focus on what can the Ravens do this time around and do differently to get that win and turn their history around. When we're looking at those previous matchups, if we go through the story of the offense, in the 4 wins, Patrick Mahomes has had 10 passing touchdowns to 1 interception. In those 4 losses, Lamar Jackson, 4 touchdown passes to 1 interception thrown. The turnovers given in terms of interceptions is very, very low. That on that scorecard and on that stat sheet doesn't really show that story. But if you're looking at the difference, when Mahomes is on fire, he's on fire. Lamar Jackson hasn't had the passing prowess in these games. And, there's obviously lots of conversations around what Jackson does. Is he a talented passer? He obviously just won his second MVP, which I think was slightly controversial for most people in terms of the stat line when you looked at what other players did, whether you think he was deserved or not. At the end of the day, he won that MVP. And, his passing has improved. In his MVP season a few years ago, he threw 36 passing touchdowns. That is a solid season for a quarterback, not to mention the rushing touchdowns and the rushing yards away from that. But in these games, in the wins for Kansas City, the difference has been those passing touchdowns and what Mahomes does when he's throwing the ball. If you look at the one win that Baltimore actually have over the Chiefs in the Jackson versus Mahomes, I'm not saying Jackson Mahomes, Jackson versus Mahomes matchup. In that game, that one game that Baltimore won by 1 point, Lamar Jackson actually threw 1 touchdown, had 2 interceptions. So from a passing point of view, he had his worst game. In that game, Mahomes was 3 passing touchdowns to 1 interception. So still a fantastic passing game from Mahomes. But when we look at the passing stats, it doesn't really show the story of why, the Ravens can't get it done. What it shows is that actually, regardless of Lamar's passing performance, there must be another reason why the Ravens can't get it done and why the Ravens in that game could get it done, which I'll jump onto a bit later. That shows the passing difference in terms of touchdowns. We'll chat a bit about the yards more so later on. I want to talk about that when it comes to defense. If we move on to the difference in Lamar's rush yards, talking about the passing, let's talk about, one of the reasons why Lamar was such a high prospect and why so many people like him as both an athlete and a player. If we look at Lamar's rush yards in those wins, you're looking at first game, 67 yards. Second game, 46 yards and a touchdown. Third game, 83 yards. Fourth game in that fourth loss, 54 yards, which was the most recent game. not mass totals. That 83 yards is maybe the outlier, but at the end of the day, that still doesn't. There's still not that kind of incredible post 100-yard game that we're looking at from Mahomes. If we now compare that to, not from Mahomes, from Jackson, if we now compare that to Jackson's rushing stats in the one win they have over the Chiefs, that is 107 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Okay, now we're starting to get a bit of an understanding of the story. When the Ravens can run the ball with Jackson, when they can do that, that makes a difference in these games. And I think that is also the story of a lot of those games. You know, when you leave the ball in Jackson's hands, he isn't that natural passer. He is a fantastic passer. He can make the plays and all that. But when you think of Lamar Jackson, you think of him ripping off that massively long touchdown against the Bengals, whatever it was, 60, 70 yards rushing touchdown, throwing a spin move in there. You look at that agileness and the agility and go, that's what we want from Jackson. That is the difference. You're seeing in that win, the difference of the win, which was 1 point in the end. Those gains, the rushing prowess from Jackson is what got them over the line, is what got them that win against the Chiefs. When we look at the story of their most recent games in the AFC Championship, not only was everyone saying, why aren't they rushing the ball with their running backs and going for their identity, which is rushing the ball? Also, why is Jackson not rushing the ball? Why is the pass now being the thing? Why are we getting too clever with it? Just run the damn ball with the guy that you've got literally to be there, to be your quarterback, make those plays. But when the play's not on, he makes something happen with his legs. Mahomes still does that in games. You know, you look at Mahomes and go, you know, arguably the best passer in the league, arguably the best quarterback in the league. But when you look at these highlight reel of plays and what he does, you think about that Super Bowl against the Eagles and when, you know, he's on half a foot and he's able to make a rushing play that gets him down the field. Those are the differences. It doesn't make sense to be in a game where you've got Lamar Jackson as a quarterback and just put it into his hands and not rush the ball and not give him the ability to jump out of the pocket and make those plays and run downfield. The smart decision-making in those situations is what has led to him having 2 MVPs. When it's one or the other and it's one-dimensional, that's what doesn't work. So now we're starting to see a bit of an idea of what has happened in these previous games. But if we look at not just rush yards from Lamar, but we look at rush yards from Baltimore as a team. If we look at the 4 wins from Kansas City, Baltimore's totals are 194 team rush yards, 203, 132, and most recently 81. The lowest scoring game of this history of matchups, but also from a team where in their lone win against Kansas City in the Jackson era, he had over 100 yards rushing. As a team in that previous game, 81, that is absolutely ridiculous for a team whose identity is rushing. If we look at the team rush yards in Baltimore's win, their lone win against Kansas City, 251. That's more. That's feeding into the evidence of what I've just said. It's not just about Jackson, but if you can get Jackson the ball and get him over those 100 yards and get your running backs on the front foot, you can beat this Kansas City team. You can do it against them. You can make those wins happen. You know, if we're looking at it in terms of offense, Lamar can run. And what is the difference now? They have Derrick Henry. Do you look at that game in the AFC Championship and go, okay, if you don't have Derrick Henry, do the Ravens lose that game? If you do have Derrick Henry, do you suddenly rush the ball more? It doesn't make any excuse for those play calls and what they were doing in the decision making, but still, if you have Derrick Henry, you're really going to not be rushing that ball. Henry also historically has done incredibly well against the Chiefs in these games. In 6 games, he's had 672 yards rushing, nearly 700 yards rushing, and 8 rushing touchdowns. Just to point out that the first game he played against the Chiefs, he wasn't even the starter. DeMarco Murray was still actually the starter of the Titans. So you're looking at a game where he wasn't the starter, but he still had 2 rushing touchdowns. So now if you move that into this next game, from an offensive point of view, what is it that the Ravens need to do? We could talk about the Chiefs and what they do, but at the end of the day, Mahomes has 3 Super Bowls. We know they can win. We know that Mahomes can make the magic happen. It's pointless talking about that. We're looking at what can the Ravens do to turn that script around? What can they do to get back to the playoffs and get to that elusive Super Bowl that Jackson hasn't been able to make despite the MVPs? When you've got 2 MVPs but no Super Bowl to show for it, you know, that's got to be almost more hunger and more power that's going for Jackson going forward. So in terms of offense, what you need to do is you need to get the ball into not Jackson's hands, but Jackson's feet. Let him run the ball down Kansas City with Derrick Henry. And that's your kind of plot to get the offense on the line. Now, if you move to defense with Jackson as a quarterback in the last 5 years, 5, 6 years, they have struggled against Mahomes. They have only allowed less than 27 points once. That was obviously in the most recent game that the Chiefs played against the Ravens. And even in Baltimore's only win against Kansas City with Jackson, the defense let in 35 points. It's showing they're not able to make that complete game. Suddenly you have a game where the defense only lets in 17 points and you still can't get the win. So if we look at that in terms of last season, historically good defense for Baltimore, now they go into this season, they've lost a few pieces. Does that say the story is not going to be good for them? Does this mean that they're going to pick up the loss here? Well, let's have a look at that. In terms of one of those pieces that lost, obviously defensive coordinator Mike McDonald, so many McDaniels in the league, it's ridiculous. But Mike McDonald was obviously hired as the head coach for Seattle, potentially bringing back that Legion of Boom era. So when you look into this season, you're looking at a new unproven defensive coordinator for Baltimore, which is Zach Orr. I couldn't quite figure out to say second name, but it's Zach and second name ORR. Now, he's not unknown to Baltimore. He might be an unknown entity in terms of it's his first defensive coordinator role, but he was the inside linebackers coach for at least last season for Baltimore. So you are promoting from inside. You are promoting a guy who previously was part of that team and part of that defense that was there last year. So it's not completely alien for him. But despite that, he is still unproven. One of the things we've noticed is you can have an all-star roster, but if you haven't got the coach, it doesn't mean anything. And that includes having the offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator. We look at the Bears, you look at their head coach from a defensive point of view, great. But if your offensive coordinator is Luke Getsky and you can't do anything, that's an issue. You look at the opposite side of it. Josh McDaniels goes to become head coach of the Raiders. But if he does that and can't focus on being an offensive coordinator, suddenly the offense suffered. So those are the differences. And that's what kind of concerns me, I guess, about the Ravens going into this season, because it doesn't matter if you've retained most of your pieces. When it comes to it, you need the coordinator. You need that glue that holds them together. Harbaugh's going to hold the team together. He's going to hold that offense together. But what is he going to do for that defense? What is Zach Orr going to do for that defense? I'm unsure. Now, if we look at another piece that was lost by the Ravens this season, they obviously lost Jadeveon Clowney. Say what you will about Jadeveon Clowney, in terms of his role on that defense last season, he was an absolute pressure machine. What this means now is now that you have lost Clowney signed with the Panthers, there is a position for a pass rusher to step up. I think for the Ravens this year, what that person and who that person is going to be is David Ojabo. David Ojabo, obviously second-round pick from 2 seasons ago. Looks like he was going to be a first-round pick. Tore his Achilles at his pro day and then kind of dropped down draft boards, but the Ravens still picked him up. He is now over 2 years removed from that Achilles injury. He had a couple of games last season. He was only activated in November of last season. So, he hasn't had that much playing time, but now is his opportunity to step up. Now is his opportunity to get back to, those Michigan game days and what he can do in that first round pick potential status, that the unfortunate injury for him made the difference. I think when you look at Baltimore, the help that they have in the secondary and how good they are in the secondary does kind of put Ojabo in a position to be able to generate that pressure. I think a full off season with no injury, almost, this is basically his sophomore season. He's still young. He's only 24. He's going to bounce back. And I'm quite excited to see what he does. Say what you will about Clowney, he was a pressure machine. Has never really lived up to where he was picked in the draft or what people thought he could be. However, Ojabo is a guy who's going to be hungry, young, coming in there, wants to prove his position, wants to prove what he can do and show what he can do coming back from that injury. So I'm excited to see that. If we look at probably, before I come to the conclusion what I think is going to happen in this game, we look at that second kind of key piece that was lost by Baltimore, which was Patrick Queen, the inside linebacker. To be honest, I think this is less of a blow than Jadeveon Clowney. Roquan Smith owns the middle of that field, incredible player and all that. I think that you pair most people up with Roquan Smith on the inside of that field and you're going to have a good time and you're going to have a solid season. So I think if you look at it, Patrick Queen, I don't necessarily think he was amazing his first couple of seasons. I think he's shown my favorite thing to say, which is showing flashes. Pairing him with a perennial all-pro player is one of the ways you're going to get the most out of him. If we move to this season and move to what the Ravens have in this season, they did pick an inside linebacker in the most previous draft, but the draft before that, they picked Trenton Simpson in the 3rd round. What I like about this is the fact that you're not getting a linebacker suddenly going from the draft straight into the starting team. You've got a linebacker who has had a season to learn from the best, learn from Roquan Smith, learn from, even Patrick Queen in that situation, who is now likely going to go in and be that second inside linebacker alongside Roquan Smith. So you've got a guy there who isn't going to be completely unfamiliar with the Ravens. He was there on that team last year, didn't have as much playing time, but he was still there. Now stepping into a position, he has the physical attributes. You learn that mental side of the game from Roquan Smith, and then suddenly you've shored up the inside linebacker spots for that team, which is great. And I think it makes an incredible difference to be able to learn from a guy like Smith and then go into a situation. You talk about quarterbacks having the time like Jordan Love to sit for a few years before he goes into that starting position. It works the same with every other position. That's why you have your crafty veterans and your players that the young guys can learn from. And if I'm honest, the story for defense has been more on the backside in the secondary than it has been for pressures and for sacks. If we look at the sacks in the 4 wins for Kansas City, they had 3 sacks, 1 sack, 0 sacks in the 3rd game, and then 2 sacks. If you look at the sacks in the win for Baltimore, they had 0 sacks. So the story of pressures, and if you can get to Mahomes, that doesn't necessarily mean you're suddenly going to knock him off and he's not going to have that 300-yard game. He's not going to have that 4 passing touchdown game. The difference has been the passing defense on the end. Generate that pressure, but then you need to have that pass defense on the second side. In 3 of the wins that the Chiefs have had, Mahomes has thrown for over 350 yards, closer to 400 yards. Even in the loss they had, he threw for he threw for 343 yards. So he threw for nearly 350 yards even in the loss that they had, which is only obviously that 1-point loss for Kansas City. In the most recent game, he's still in a low-scoring game where they only scored 17 points. He still threw for nearly 300 yards, 274. So what that is showing me is that what the Ravens need to do, they need to generate that pressure, but you need to focus on having those linebackers defend in the middle and defend on the backside. In the most recent game, that was what happened. The pass defense was very good. So 274 yards for Mahomes is, a very mediocre game for him in comparison to everything else and what we're kind of used to with him from a passing point of view. So what they need to do is focus on that pass defense. And I think that, as I said, the biggest loss I think was Clowney. As from a player point of view, they've obviously lost their defensive coordinator, but I think you retained everyone else. I think they still have that ability to defend like that from a pass defense point of view and stop Mahomes from putting up a 350-yard game. I think if they can keep him under 300 yards, if they can keep him to 250 yards, I think that the Ravens have a very, very strong chance of winning this game. Now, let's look at the conclusion. Like I said, to kind of prefix this entire thing, for Baltimore to win, realistically, they need a complete game. They need to be able to rush the ball with Mahomes. They need to be able to rush the ball with Henry, not have any bonehead mistakes. I keep going back to Mahomes. It's that having Jackson and Mahomes and their matchup with a guy who has a brother called Jackson Mahomes makes it very, very difficult to be able to keep concentrating on this. Let's look at Baltimore. So Baltimore needs to have a complete rushing game from Jackson and a complete rushing game from Derrick Henry to be able to make the difference. Put the ball in Henry's hand. Give him more than 20 carries a game. Excellent. Perfect. That's what they need to do. Put the ball into Lamar Jackson's feet. There's a concern there because he's dropped weight this season, which might make him more agile, but at the end of the day, can he take those hits? He's had some injuries in the past. Unsure about that, but you still need to put the ball in his hands. If he can keep himself safe, if he can rush that ball, put up over 100 yards in that game alongside Henry putting up 100 yards, there's not a lot I feel like the Chiefs can do. Like I said, the defense needs to focus on that pass coverage. Ojabo needs to step up and generate that pressure. But at the end of the day, historically, the pressure hasn't made a difference. We've seen what Mahomes could do when he gets pressure, sees pressure, and sees that he can, work with that. So at the end of the day, it comes down for me, what is the biggest difference? I think if the Ravens had Henry in that AFC Championship game, they would have won. So what do I look at for this game? What is my prediction for this game? I'm picking that the Ravens do have that complete game. It's going to be a close one again. It always is between these two teams. And I think that the Ravens pick up a 31-28 win to kick off their season. Like I said with the defense has never been that great, and they've only kept Kansas City to less than 27 points once. In this game, I think they keep them to 28 points, just above that, just above kind of their average of what they've done historically in the last matchups with Jackson versus Mahomes. But I think in this, it's going to be holding them to less than 30 is going to make the difference. And I think that the Ravens are going to learn from their mistakes in that AFC Championship game and rush the damn ball. 31-28 to the Ravens to kick off their season. That's what I think is going to happen, even if they're going into hostile environment in Arrowhead. Amazing. I hope you enjoyed the analysis of that. I hope you're also looking forward to this game. You can also keep me accountable on the score prediction, which is always fun and always good to see. That's what I like doing these and like chatting about, how close I got things when it actually comes to the game. But for now, thanks for joining me for this episode. Gav will be back for our episode next week. This is just a one-off of him not being able to make it, unfortunately, and I wanted to get this episode out. Follow us on Instagram at ClutchdownPod. We post loads of reels on there with conversations from each episode, talking about different things that have happened. We want people to join in the discussion. Look at this. Tell me what you think. Do you think I'm talking absolute bullshit? And do you think that, the Chiefs are going to win 40-9 and have a fantastic game and that's it? Do you think that Jackson's going to put up 200 rush yards or 400 pass yards? Just tell me. Let me know. I want to have that discussion. If you think I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. I'm happy to do that. To do that, follow us on Instagram at ClutchdownPod. And then now that we're doing these video episodes, I post the full-length ones on YouTube, which it feels like from the amount of views I saw in the last week, a lot of people are enjoying. So subscribe to us on YouTube at Clutchdown Podcast rather than at Clutchdown Pod. I managed to get the whole thing this time. Subscribe, like, comment. Again, tell me what you want for future episodes. Tell me what you think. Listen to the episode, join in the discussion. And then again, if you prefer some company on your travels, we're also on Spotify. So look up Clutchdown Podcast on Spotify. Go for any of the old episodes. Tell me I'm wrong from 2 years ago. Also totally happy with that. Do all that. Instagram at Clutchdown Pod. YouTube at Clutchdown Podcast. Then give us a listen on Spotify at Clutchdown Podcast, or just search Clutchdown Podcast, and then we'll see you again next week.
Mode.